For 2,800 years, we have read the Odyssey wrong, not by accident, by choice. We wanted the Greeks as victims, the besieged, the lost, the wanderers. But the text says the opposite. It took a population geneticist, an ancient DNA study, and a Christopher Nolan blockbuster to prove it. By the time you finish this video, you will have to decide, is the Odyssey a heroic epic or a war criminal's testimony disguised as a survival story? Western tradition read the Odyssey as a victim narrative. Greeks as the besieged, the wandering, the lost, the ones who endured. This became foundational to Western identity, the long journey home, the struggle against chaos, the hero enduring fate. The Sea Peoples fit neatly into that frame, the external destroyer, the faceless horde that toppled the Bronze Age world. The problem is that the evidence never supported it. Egyptian records at Medinet Habu list the Sea Peoples by name: Ekwesh, Denyen, Shurdan, Peliset, Checker. The Ekwesh are the Achaeans. The Denyen are the Danans. These are not mysterious invaders. They are named Greek groups, recorded in temple inscriptions, contemporary with the events. The linguistic identification is not contested. What is contested is the interpretation of what they were doing. For 2,800 years, scholars and readers chose the victim narrative over the evidence in the text. The silence is not accidental. It is a choice repeated across centuries. But if the victim narrative was a choice, what was the alternative? The Odyssey itself preserved it, buried in a passage scholars call the Cretan lie. The answer is hiding in a passage so strange. Scholars have spent centuries calling it a lie. But what if the lie was the only honest thing Odysseus ever said? The Cretan lie runs Odyssey Book 14, lines 199 through 359, delivered to Eumaeus, a disguised Odysseus spinning a tale from his own past. The raid material sits in 4 clusters, and the verbatim text reads like this. Lust for adventure drove me to the sea. I fitted out 9 ships. The men joined at once, and we feasted for 6 days. But swept away by their own reckless fury, my crew went berserk. They promptly began to plunder the lush Egyptian farms, dragged off the women and children, killed the men. Outcries reached the city in no time. Stirred by shouts, an Egyptian army came charging out. My men were killed or enslaved. But I escaped by running to the king's chariot, grasping his knees, and begging for mercy. This is not the language of a hero defending a homeland. It is the language of a raider describing a campaign. Homer composed the text in the late 8th century BCE, roughly 400 years after the Bronze Age collapse. The memory was still alive. The confession was always in the text. The question is why no one wanted to read it that way. Ramesses III's great inscription of Year 8 at Medinet Habu describes the seaborne attackers meeting flame at the river mouths. The Egyptian forces drive the raiders into the shallow channels. A stockade of lances rises on the shoreline. The raiders are dragged from their ships, enclosed on all sides, prostrated on the beach, their bodies left to rot under the delta sun. The reliefs show it in stone, the captured being led away by Egyptian soldiers, the naval battle unfolding in the shallows with ships locked together, the Egyptian archers lining the banks releasing volleys into the exposed raiders. Now read Odyssey Book 14, lines 265 through 272 from the other side of that line. The raiders committed on land, confident in their numbers, spread across the farms, plundering, killing, taking what they could carry. Then the mass defensive response. The Egyptian king musters his forces. Dawn breaks. The charge comes. Annihilation on the shore. The survivors are taken, not killed. Odysseus, the narrator of this confession, is among them, spared, forced to remain in Egypt for years while the men he led lie dead on the beach. Set side by side, these two accounts reveal the same event, same battle, same delta, same outcome. Scholars like Jeffrey P. Emanuel have noted these correspondences. The prevailing view treats them as memory preserved in fiction, not proof, but a historically plausible tradition. This is the context for interpreting the entire Sea Peoples narrative, not as mystery, but as testimony. But here is the question the textbooks skip. If the testimony is real, who exactly is testifying? The answer is carved into Egyptian stone, and it has been waiting 3,000 years for us to look up. So who exactly were these raiders? The Egyptians carved their names into stone, And those names tell a story we refuse to follow. Egyptian records at Medinet Habu list the sea peoples by name: Shurdan, Peliset, Denyen, Cheker, Ekwesh. The temple walls are covered in carved reliefs, the naval battle unfolding in the shallows with ships locked together, Egyptian archers lining the banks, prisoners being led away in chains. Above each captured group, the hieroglyphic labels spell out their names: the Peliset, the Denyen, the Cheker, the Ekwesh. These are public inscriptions, carved in stone, contemporary with the events they depict. The Ekwesh are the Achaeans, the same people Hittite records call Ahiawa. The Denyen are the Danaians, the Danaoi of Homer's epic, the name used interchangeably with Achaeans throughout the Odyssey. These are not mysterious invaders. They are named Greek groups, recorded in Egyptian stone, contemporary with the events. The question is not identification. It is what the Achaeans were doing on the wrong side of Egyptian spears. And the answer forces a choice you cannot unmake. Were the Greeks invaders who destroyed a world, or refugees fleeing a world that had already collapsed? Tom Holland's reading treats the Sea Peoples as the destroyers of Mycenaean civilization, the external force that toppled the palaces. Population geneticist Iosif Lazaridis pushes back directly. There is, he says, no evidence that Sea Peoples destroyed the palaces of Mycenae and Pylos. The Ekwesh and Denyen were the Achaeans and Danaians, but the palaces collapsed from internal failure, megadrought, administrative breakdown, systemic collapse. The Aegean warriors who became Sea Peoples in Egyptian records were the ones who left a dying world, not the ones who destroyed it. The Feldman study confirms this. A marked influx of people with Aegean genetic ancestry into the Levant and Egypt during the Iron Age transition, 1200 to 1000 BCE. At Ashkelon, early Iron Age Philistines carried roughly 39% Aegean ancestry, absent before this period, diluted in later generations. That 39% is a modeled proportion. Researchers compared ancient genomes from Ashkelon against reference populations from the Bronze Age Aegean, Anatolia, and the Levant, then calculated which mixture best explains the genetic signature. The Southern Arc study made this possible, sequencing 727 ancient individuals across 11,000 years, establishing a baseline genetic fingerprint for each region. When a population with a different fingerprint appeared, the change was detectable, measurable, and datable. At Ashkelon, 0% Aegean ancestry in the late Bronze Age, 39% in the early Iron Age, then diluted back toward Levantine norms. This is not a conquering army. It is a pulse. Refugees and raiders who arrived, stayed a generation or two, and were absorbed. The bones confirm the migration. But the text explains the motive, and that is where the real reversal begins. What happens next does not just rewrite the history of the Bronze Age, it rewrites the Odyssey. And it might force you to ask, what else have we been reading wrong? The Odyssey transforms from a wanderer's lament to a raider's testimony. The journey home is not a flight from catastrophe. It is a return from a campaign. The Sea Peoples are not a mystery solved by genetics or archaeology. They were named, remembered, and recorded in the text we already had. The genetic evidence from Ashkelon confirms a pulse of migration, not a permanent conquest. 39% Aegean ancestry in the early Iron Age, absent before, diluted after. The question is not whether the Achaeans were the Sea Peoples. It is why we needed a Hollywood blockbuster to force us to see it. The text already knew. Lazaridis' work constrains the interpretation. The Delta Trap locks the two accounts together. What remains is the unresolved question. What does it mean to have spent 28 centuries reading a war criminal's confession as a victim's lament? The film builds the wrong menace, a lurking external dread, a faceless horde descending on the Greek world. But it stumbles into the right ending. The camera turns, and we realize we are them. The text always knew. The names were carved into stone at Medinet Habu, contemporary with the events they record. The genetic evidence at Ashkelon constrains the timeline, a pulse of Aegean ancestry arriving in the aftermath of collapse, not a conquering army. The silence across 28 centuries was not absence of knowledge, it was a choice. The question now is not who the Sea Peoples were. It is why we needed a $250 million Hollywood blockbuster and a population geneticist running ancient DNA to force us to read what was already there. The hero was never the victim. He was the raider who survived. Subscribe to see what history is still hiding.